Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Two Bye Guys. It's been a minute. Thanks for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed the last season of Two Bye Guys, which featured lots of guys from my book, Bisexual Married Men Stories of Relationships, Acceptance, and Authenticity. And thanks to everyone who has written to me and let me know what they think of the book. I love it. I'm so happy that many of you are enjoying it and finding connections and community and insights for your own lives. Hopefully, there will be more books to come, and I hope you enjoyed last season. Welcome back to book season. It's the continuation of season 6 in a way. Season 7 was about my book. Season 6 is featuring lots of other bi authors. And we never finished the season. We had 6 amazing interviews with authors who published books about bisexuality or things related to bisexuality. But I like to do 10 episodes in a season and keep it even. My book was coming out and there wasn't enough time to finish, but I still have 4 episodes left. And in this episode, I'm so excited to get to chat with one of my earliest bi friends who was on season 1 of this podcast, helping us kick things off. In a few minutes, we'll hear from J.R. Yussuf, who wrote a book about forgiveness that we talked about in season 1. And now, 5 years later, he has written an awesome new book called Dear Bi Men, a Black man's perspective on power, consent, breaking down binaries, and combating erasure. We'll hear from him in a moment. It's an awesome interview. I loved getting to chat with him again. Before we get there, oh my God, I have like a Wolverine look thing going on today. If you're watching on Patreon, you can see what I'm talking about. Plug for the Patreon. I upload full videos of every episode to Patreon. You'll also get bonus content. Today's episode with JR, I think there's over 25 minutes of bonus content. So if you want to see me and see him and get all of that, head over to patreon.com/Robert Brooks Cohen. And before we get into the interview, one last thing about my coaching practice. So if you listened to the last episode, which came out a few months ago, I told you guys I was launching a coaching practice. If you haven't listened to that and want to know more about coaching, I did a whole 20-minute intro. Head back to the episode just before this one, and it's at the beginning of the episode. You can hear all about it. But the quick version, it's going very well. I started with a handful of clients who I love working with. We're making great progress with all of them. Just to tell you a bit about my coaching practice and my coaching philosophy, I was trained at IPEC, which stands for the Institute for Professional Excellence in Coaching. It was a 7+ month training program. I just finished it very recently. It was amazing. I learned so much. I got so much practice hours coaching other people in the program. I can coach anyone on anything, and that's what I spent the most of my time doing in this program. However, obviously, because of this podcast and my book, most of my clients at the moment are bi men. That said, whatever challenges you're working on, whatever you're going through in your life, I can help and I can help coach. The training was incredible and really has defined how I like to coach. I think there's a lot of coaches out there who haven't been trained and they give advice and they have a lot of knowledge maybe about a certain area, and that could work for some people. I also have knowledge that I can and do share with my clients, but advice is not the point of coaching for me. I don't think it's super helpful. In coaching, I'm really going to follow you. I'm not going to lead you anywhere. The way that I did things may not be the same way you want to do things. Your values and your goals may be very different from mine. I am an understanding partner. I get all of these issues. I have no judgment and no shame about these things. So you can talk to me about anything, but I'm not going to insert my opinions necessarily. We're going to follow you where you want to go and where you're ready to go. It's my job to ask open-ended, empowering questions that really help you dig into what is the core of what you're struggling with or where you want to be. And oftentimes I'm finding with some of my clients, like, it's hard to find a space to do that, especially with someone who gets this stuff. And it's hard to go like really in depth and have an hour-long conversation about this stuff that's hard to talk about. And there's some shame and there's assumptions other people will make. With my clients, we've been talking about stuff like internal and external blocks. Sometimes we know our goals and there's an external block to get there, like you want to go out to queer bars, but you live in a place where there's no queer bars, or you want to date another bi person, but there's no bi people on any apps near you. Those are external blocks. We can strategize and brainstorm and talk about how to overcome those kind of challenges. But often we think that something is an external block, and that's why we haven't done it yet. And really, there's something internal holding us back. And that's really the focus of my coaching practice, is like figuring out what is going on. And sometimes when we know what we want to do and we have a goal and it just isn't quite happening, that's when there's a hidden internal block. And that's what I can help you find out. Sometimes there's fear associated with those things, that we want to do them, but there's some kind of anxiety or fear holding us back. Sometimes there's that voice in your head that says, I'm not good enough. We call it a gremlin in coaching. It could be any version of I'm not good enough. It could be I'm not smart enough. I'm not hot enough. I'm not young enough. I'm not queer enough. Those kind of things we can work on together. Sometimes we make assumptions based on the past about how things will go in the future. Sometimes we make interpretations about what other people think. So these are all the kinds of things we can go over and we can discuss. I am offering a 9-session coaching package, which I believe is a great amount to really dig into these issues, make some forward progress, set some goals, and see the actual results within a few months. 9 sessions also helps us get some momentum. That said, some people are not ready for 9 sessions, and so I do offer single sessions, and you can do as many or as few as you want. There's a discount when you book the 9 sessions, but single sessions are great too. Maybe you would just want to try it. Head to my website if you're interested, robertbrookscohen.com/coaching, or there's a coaching button at the top of the page. I'm going to put my pricing up there. My pricing, the lucky people who already started coaching with me got a little bit of a discount. And this price may not stick around forever. It will likely go up in the future. So if you're curious to do it and interested, now is the time. I'm going to put my pricing up on the website so that people are more aware. And they know what they're getting into when you book an intro call. If you are interested, regardless of whether you're sure you want to commit, feel free to book a free intro call with me and we can discuss it, and we can discuss how this would apply to you specifically. I am also starting to do some group coaching. I actually think if you're listening to this when it comes out, I'm going to do something this week. I don't exactly know what day. I want to just start testing it out and practicing and seeing what kind of format works best for group coaching. So I'm going to offer a huge discount. Check the social media for 2 Bi Guys to find out when and where those group coaching sessions will be. I will post it on the 2 Bi Guys Instagram for sure. Overall, even without the discount, group coaching will be much more affordable than individual coaching. And while you may not get as much one-on-one coaching time with me, it can also be really valuable to meet other people and see what they're going through and watch them get coached. So there's a lot of value to the group coaching as well. So check that out. I'm excited to start group coaching. Oh, I've started doing stand-up comedy. That's a sort of a non sequitur. It doesn't really relate to this podcast, but I love it. And most of my set so far is talking about bisexuality and non-monogamy. Shocker, I know. I'm normally not so open about these topics. I don't know exactly why I'm sharing this. It's just something I'm excited about. It's been so fun. I want to keep doing it. And I hopefully want to bring some of that flavor to this podcast. So, not that it's not fun to learn things, but maybe we'll throw in a few more jokes. That's all I can think of. This has been long enough already. So without further ado, here is my interview with J.R. Yussuf about his new book, Dear Bi Men. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to 2 Bi Guys. I'm so excited to be with a familiar face from the beginning of my journey, someone I met way back at Bi Request a long time ago, who has also been on the podcast before. J.R. Yussuf is back on 2 Bi Guys. Welcome back, J.R.
Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here. You have no idea.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see you. It's been a while. So J.R. Yussuf is a Nigerian-American New York native. For those of you who don't know, he's a writer, director, and actor. He's appeared on stage and in film and TV. He hosts the Let's Heal Already podcast. He created the hashtag Bisexual Men Speak, which we love to use. And he's an award-winning author for The Other F Word, Forgiveness, which we talked about last time, and his new book. He's here on book season. This is the continuation of book season, even though the first half of book season was like a long time ago. We're continuing with some bi authors and his new book. I'm holding it up. If you're watching the video, if you're listening, you can't hear it. It's called Dear Bi Men, A Black Man's Perspective on Power, Consent, Breaking Down Binaries, and Combating Erasure. It comes out in April 2024, which should be when this podcast comes out. And he was one of the first guests on season 1 of Two Bi Guys. So welcome back, J.R. Yussuf. Hi.
Hi,
Okay.
thank you so much. That was a cool little intro. I appreciate it. Yeah, it's been a minute, and this time I'm back. I'm back with another book. So much has changed,
Yeah,
especially since in the world, and also especially since you and I first met. So it's
yeah.
just very cool to be back here, and I'm happy that you still have the podcast going and just keep growing and everything. It's very cool to see.
Thank you. I know I didn't really know what to expect when we started that thing in 2019, but yeah, you and I met probably 2018, I'm thinking, and then we started this podcast in 2019. So, man, 5 years ago, you were here last, kicking us off with season 1. So, let's start there. I'm curious, like, since 5 years ago, what's new for you in this world of sexuality, gender identity? Like, has your conception of yourself or your sexuality or identity changed since then, or clarified or deepened? What's gone on?
Yeah. What a great question. I
Thank you.
I have learned so much more about myself and the ways that things that I've experienced and witnessed have impacted my expectations of others, my expectations of myself. So my relationship with myself has deepened, which is really, really nice. I've learned a lot more about psychology and neuroscience and the body and white supremacy, as we will get to in this interview.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I am here. I am existing on this planet. I don't know. It's a lot that I've learned, and I think I've also realized like, oh, I've come to this place where I really need to take a step away from doing a lot of sort of like bi advocacy work,
Mm,
or at the very least, certainly shift my position and shift who I'm talking to. And so a lot of this book really is about realizing like, oh, something inside of me is sort of like closing, right? Like
mm,
sort of my ability to have certain conversations around these topics is closing.
mm.
And I also recognize that because I've been doing so much research and reading and living, I have amassed a certain amount of sort of knowledge or understanding. And so I wanted to share that, kind of as like a last hurrah, sort of as like okay, kind of
Interesting.
okay. I'm gonna take a step back, or I'm gonna change my position. Um, and so yeah, I was like, okay, I need to write this book, and I am not gonna even think about talking to people who are not bisexual or pansexual or fluid. I'm gonna specifically just talk to us, and specifically talk to men or masculine people, and that's what I sort of sought out to do with this book.
Cool. I love that. And that's the title, Dear by Men. That's interesting. I didn't expect you to say that you were going to take a step back from all this and that this is like the last hurrah pushing it out there. Like what led to that realization that you want to sort of get this out there and then take a step back? Because I get that I need a
Yeah.
lot of breaks from this stuff, but also like people are going to read this and probably want to talk to you about it and want you to come
Mhm.
talk about it. So how'd that come about?
Yeah. Lots of burnout, lots of
Uh-huh.
unhealthy
Uh-huh.
unhealthy pressure I was putting on myself, but also lots of overextending, and also lots of like talking to people who are not bisexual. And so I think that there's something about that in particular that for me doesn't work or
Mm,
feels really unsustainable because it is a matter of survival for me. I think similarly, if I were to be spending a lot of time talking to non-black people about uh, anti-black racism or things like that, I think that for me personally, there would be something about that would be not only draining but just completely unsustainable for me. And
hmm
so it's kind of like that. And also recognizing like, I actually want to live. Like I don't want to spend so much time like teaching or educating or even researching and learning. I want to actually just like live my bisexual ass life. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I totally get that. Yeah, maybe I should take a break longer sometimes too. Um, okay, so this book then is sort of targeted toward bi people, and maybe even more specifically, like who is this book? Who did you write it for in mind? And like,
Mhm.
we'll get into the details, but like, what's your overall sort of mission with this book? Like, what do you want to tell people with this?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I would say that bare bones, if I had to sum it up in one sentence, this book I really wrote for masculine people, masculine bi people who have thought about taking a gender studies class, who have maybe had some college, or who have maybe gone all the way through college and thought about taking a gender sexuality studies class. Whether they did or they didn't, they thought about it, that's really who the book is
Okay.
for. When we,
hmm
right,
That's
same.
me.
Uh, I never got around to taking the gender studies courses, but
Me
I thought
either.
about it.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
and then I guess a bit more. I, I am writing this to Black bisexual men, Black bi, Black pan, Black fluid men, masculine people, and yeah, I think that was so important for me because of the specific ways that, because of anti blackness and white supremacy culture, Black bisexual men have been scapegoated. And there is like a lot of like targeted negativity toward Black expressions of sexuality, whether it be bisexual, pansexual, or whether it just be, heterosexual desire. And so, yeah, those are some of my target audiences, and I guess wait, I feel like you asked me another question. What else was in there?
Well, what do you want that target audience to take from your book? I mean, we'll get into lots of details, but what's the
Hmm.
big picture?
Right, right. I think also what I wanted to say about this is that as we as time continues forward, so many more people are realizing like, oh, I am bi, I am pan, I am fluid, or I just have desire for people of various genders. And so I wanted to have a resource where people can go and like learn more about, bisexual desire and also recognize how important consent and power is when we are talking about these conversations and
Mhm.
have more of like a sort of like a critical eye, yes. And yeah, hopefully like that consent piece is really in there, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I think that just our everyday lives, like regardless of your sexuality, our everyday lives would improve if we all practiced everyday consent and learn more about consent, have more conversations about consent. So,
Yeah. It definitely comes through. I have some questions about that we'll get to in a few minutes, but I do think that was like a really unique part of this book, this focus on power and consent, because I think that's not always part of the bi discourse. Like we're talking about sexual fluidity stuff, but like not always how that intersects with just foundational sexuality things like power and consent. And so I we'll get into that in a few minutes. Uh, it definitely is there. Let's talk for a minute, just sort of, your first episode here was titled "Femininity and Forgiveness." Your book was about forgiveness, but we talked a lot about like femininity and what it's like to you write in this book a lot about the intersection of being Black, bisexual, and feminine, and how like each of those things is a vital component to how people perceive you and what that means for your sexuality. So how do I mean, tell us about that intersection, and also, but like, how do you think gender norms and not conforming to traditional masculinity affects both your Black identity and bi identity, and combined Black bi identity?
Yeah, yeah. So it's just so funny. I think that life, so many things change in life, and because as I mentioned in the book, starting out early as I can remember, I was considered feminine and gay and stuff because of the femininity. But as I've gotten older, I'm in my mid 30s now. Over the last couple of years, I've been actually ascribed like masculinity and also like hyper masculinity because I'm Black. So
Mm,
a lot of what I'm talking about in the book is being always bouncing between being perceived as either hyper feminine or hyper masculine. So it's
huh,
always like those two like um, poles, I guess.
uh-huh,
And depending on whether I'm perceived as masculine or feminine, the possibility of me being bisexual is if I'm perceived as hypermasculine, oh, yeah, you could be bisexual, even though it's still met with skepticism. But if I'm perceived as hyper feminine, I'm definitely not bi, So
mm,
I spent a lot of time talking about that in the book and spent a lot of time talking about privilege versus power and how many scholars have talked about how the word privilege doesn't quite go far enough, and how power is probably a better, more precise sort of way to
uh-huh,
look at these things.
uh-huh.
So yeah.
Let's get into that for a minute. Tell me
Oh
more.
yeah,
What,
sorry.
how, yeah,
Yeah.
how, I mean, we're jumping ahead, but yeah, why is it more helpful to think of it in terms of power as opposed to just
Yeah.
privilege?
Yeah. So this is certainly other people's work. This is certainly the work of Deshaun L. Harrison and other scholars. But yeah, I've witnessed something happen with words like privilege over the last couple of years as it's entered the mainstream, and I've witnessed the way people use words like privilege, and many people use it as like a sort of like a silencing sort of thing, like, oh, well, you have privilege in this way, so be quiet. I get to speak. My pain matters.
Mm,
And I think you could use any word, right, in that silencing sort of way, but it doesn't quite always help people fully understand. Power is something that definitely is pooled in this society, definitely is protected, and definitely ascribed to certain groups. However, power sometimes is also shifting moment to moment. You know what I mean? Within conversations. And
hmm
obviously, certain identities, certain, classes of people and what have you, certain those are solid. Those are there. Those are pooled there. Power is definitely pooled. Oppression is definitely real. However, power in social situations, certain dynamics are certainly shifting at times, and I think that power gets a lot closer. Privilege sometimes can depend on feelings, like, oh, like, even though I have these identities, but I don't feel like I had it easier, or I don't feel like I didn't suffer. So power kind of gets to something else outside of just feelings. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. And there's so many layers of that like I'm still unpacking. I feel like I talk with my wife a lot about like power in a even within a conversation, like who has power within this conversation and why. And like sometimes I don't even notice that, and she'll mention like, look, you have all the power in this conversation, and it's something I wasn't even kind of aware of, and then we kind of pause and like take that in. And so it is really like, I think for a lot of like, especially someone like me who was identified as a straight white cis guy for 29 years of my life, it's like you don't even I didn't even realize all the power that I had, or because it's like, oh, people believe what you say, and like if you don't have the opposite experience, like you just think everyone believes what everyone says, you know. And so like, oh, I actually have this power that makes it, you know, it feels natural, but actually not everyone has that. So it's like it's something I've had to learn to notice.
Mm.
There was a section in somewhere in the first part of the book
Hmm.
about that. This comes up a lot on the podcast and with the guys I talk to about their bisexuality, about like having more emotional connections with women, but more sexual connections with men. And like on an individual level, that can make a lot of sense and is totally valid. But I this is sort of a way in which power dynamics work invisibly for many people. Like you wrote about how that preference can really just come from the power dynamics of patriarchy, and because women are conditioned to do this emotional labor, so then we might connect emotionally more easily. Can you talk about that and sort of how that works?
Yes. Yes, yes, I definitely can. And yeah, I think that I'm just thinking back to like being a child and even now throughout my life, and um like wow, like so many people are able to have even fleeting emotional conversations or um things like that with girls and women, and it's kind of like second nature. It's like not something that you really even might even think about. You might just like very quickly say something to maybe a barista or maybe like a person that you work with or whatever, that you wouldn't say that to a man. And that is one of the ways like patriarchy gets to define who we are, right? It says that we are not emotional feeling creatures, like, and we are not safe spaces for other people's emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And even if like you're probably going to have to do a lot of work to become an emotional safe space for people, if if you're a boy, if you're a man, because that's going to be like really, it's a lot of people are not going to support you in being that, right? um but just that sort of like automatic, like, oh yeah, we just know, like a lot of women, even if it's the most sort of like callous woman or someone who seems shy or someone who seems a certain way, there's just something there. It's like, oh no, like this person, yeah, this woman, she can, I can say this to her, and it's like socially acceptable. And I think that I kind of try to explore some of the heartbreak in that, because you might be a man who wants to have these like deeper emotional connections with other men, but you might not know how, and it might be seen as inappropriate. And the man that you're trying to emotionally connect with, might not know how to connect with you or might not want to, because once
Mm-hmm.
again, they don't see you as sort of like capable of that, of being an emotional safe space.
Right.
Excuse me.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that like this is definitely about sexuality, and it's also about gender and it's also
Yeah.
about the world we live in, power. It's also about, so many things.
Right.
So,
Right. I mean, I think that's like a big theme of your book is how, just like how many different things intersecting can affect everything, any situation. And, you know, sexuality is a big factor and gender is a big factor, but it's not just those alone. Yeah.
right, and preference. And so like obvious, like,
Yeah.
if over time, over and over and over and over again, you've experienced so many women, so many girls being just kind or emotionally warm or a relatively safe space, even if it wasn't the deepest emotional conversation. You've experienced so
Yeah.
much of that.
Right.
Of course, that would probably have an impact on who you emotionally prefer to connect with. Like,
Right.
yeah, it probably
Yeah.
will. Like, it makes sense if you see women as like, oh yeah, I would want to have like a relationship and connect and blah blah blah. And with men, like, I want to have sex with men. Like, you know what I mean?
Right.
Like, yeah,
Right.
yeah, that kind of makes sense.
It honestly makes so much sense that I'm like almost ashamed of myself for not understanding this sooner. Like, I feel like even a week ago before I read this, I was like thinking of myself as someone who has lots of fluid attractions across, like nothing's a disqualifier to me. But I would say I tend to connect better emotionally and romantically with women and sexually with men. Like, I even
Yeah,
thought that a week ago. And now I'm like,
yeah,
well, is that actually me? Or is that actually just like all the women I've ever tried to connect with were conditioned to be good at emotional connection and to create a safe space for me to feel that way? Like, is it
yeah.
actually me, or is it just my reaction to everything around me? Yeah, I've had to
These
rethink that in the
questions.
last week because of you.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for like, like acknowledging like, oh, like I feel some shame here because I think that it's really natural to feel that way when you learn new information and also when so many people have taught us that like, oh, as a man, you should know this, you should already know this, you should already be strong, you should already be self-sufficient. And so I want to acknowledge that, like, while reading the book, there might be a lot of sort of like shame, and there might be a lot of that comes up for a lot of people. And I want to just say that, like, it's really normal to feel that way, and it's really important not to shame whatever shame comes up, might come up,
Mm.
whatever feelings might come up. Just like kind of
Uh-huh.
like witness them and observe them, and
Yeah.
um, it's really important to really, I think, investigate our feelings, which I really hope comes through in this book. Like, really be curious about our internal world, and I think that like what I just said about curiosity about the internal world, like there was just such a lack of curiosity of my internal world by so many people throughout my life,
Mm.
and so
Mm-hmm.
like I think because of that, it makes me more curious about people's internal lives and especially about men's internal lives. And I think that just having that curiosity alone can improve your interactions with men.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because, like, I feel like so many people, myself included, make assumptions about people based on gender, presentation, race, whatever, and approaching from a point of view of curiosity about, well, who is this person? And I don't know anything about them until I ask them. Like, that does feel like sort of a better place to be than obviously making assumptions about people. Yeah.
Exactly. And the part about like questioning, like, well, who am I? Like, that's what you kind of said. And it was so like
Yeah.
beautiful because
Yeah.
it's like very real. It's like, wait, how much how much of the things that I do like and that I am drawn to have been decided for me? And
Right.
how much have I decided? And
Right.
what then now what does that mean? Who am I?
Right.
And I had this moment when I was reading the work of Sabrina Strings. She wrote an incredible book about the racist history of fat phobia, and really, really, really remarkable book that I recommend to pretty much anybody who will listen to me speak. And I had these really big existential questions come up
Uh-huh.
because when you really learn about the project that is white supremacy, you recognize like, oh, this gets into everything. Like it gets into everything like sand. It gets into everything. It's
Mhm.
not just It's not just who we think of as important in society or who is in leadership position. It's not just this. It's not just this. It touches everything. And in this book, I talk about health and wellness. And for the longest time, that was my thing, right? Being healthy. In this book, I talk about leaving Christianity back in 2012. And part of why I left was like, oh, this is destroying me. Like these beliefs, there's something incongruent. There's something about it that's literally hurting me. Okay, let's try to be healthy and leave. And
Hmm.
so health was my guiding force. Wellness was my guiding force. And then I spent some time reading. I spent some time living, and I realized, ah, health as we know it is also a project of white supremacy.
Yeah.
How do you get
Oh, interesting. What, say more about that. What do you mean that health, like, yeah, is a
out?
product of white supremacy?
Yes,
How
sorry.
so?
It's um I guess I could take something as simple as the idea of eating 3 meals per day is normal and
Hmm.
healthy. This was actually part of racism. Indigenous people to North America did something that we now call intuitive eating, right? They've rebranded. It's like, oh, and eat intuitively. Initially, this is what Native American people,
People did.
indigenous people, were always doing. They ate when they were hungry. They ate if
Oh,
they had a super busy day where they were moving a lot. Oh, they ate more that day. If they had a day where they were more sedentary, they weren't as hungry, so they ate less.
uh-huh.
That was characterized as savage, and white people are sophisticated. White people eat 3 meals per day,
Huh.
consisting of these things. And all of that other stuff, that is what animals do, that is savage. No.
Yeah.
So,
Interesting.
and there are so, Rob, there are so many examples of like, this is just the 3 meals a day thing. There are just so many examples everywhere that literally make up our entire like world. And so I've gone through, I guess I'm sharing this because I want to say I've gone through many, many metamorphoses as I've learned more about myself, as I've learned more about indigenous people, as I've learned more about people of color all over the world and the project that is white supremacy. I've just learned, like, oh, wow. And like, okay, we are witnessing myself feel shame, or we're witnessing myself feel lied to, or what is even reality? Okay, we're witnessing these feelings, and okay, what are we gonna do? What's gonna happen? What needs to happen? Or is it enough to just sometimes just witness things and understand?
Interesting. That's really fascinating. There's a lot of stuff like that in the book, although I either I missed that the eating 3 times a day. I either
Oh, I
missed
didn't
it
put
or,
that. I
or
didn't put that one
it's not in the
in.
book.
No, I
But
didn't.
it but
No,
it
no, no.
but it reminds me of stuff that's in there, and it's really fascinating because it's like, oh yeah, intuitive eating, like that makes sense. You don't even think about how the things we all consider normal in our everyday lives are like that they're a product of these hierarchies, and that like many of them take us away from looking inward at ourselves. Like even that one of just like, am I hungry or not? Like, oh, it's dinner time, I eat dinner, but like we forget to check in with ourselves. And I think that's such a good, easy example of how we do that in so many other areas. We don't check in with ourselves. Like even my straightness for the first 29 years was just like very default, and didn't check in with myself on that for many years. And there's just so many other kinds of things that I think are part of my identity that actually the more I dive into it, I'm like, oh, maybe I don't feel that way. I just kind of was following this expectation, and I like to people please. So I thought I felt that way. But do I?
Mm. And then this question of do I? Thank you for like talking about this because like Do I like that can be incredible. That can look like looking in, introspecting can be incredible. And in the case of bisexual men, it can also be antagonistic. Oh, but do I really like her? Oh, but do I really like men? Oh, but do I? The question, the two, like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, introspection is very important. I think that for me, okay, I'm gonna share this story. Um, couple years ago, I had just started smoking weed. Like I said before, I grew up very religious, so even smoking, drinking, in those cultures, it's associated with all kinds of just real, real bad. So even though I had left Christianity, there were all of these little things that still were just like tied to me. So anyway, I started smoking during the pandemic to get through it, and and
I kept smoking during the pandemic to get through it.
oh wait, but we are still in the pandemic. I think I meant
Yeah, yeah. The
during lockdown.
lockdowns.
Right,
Yeah,
right, right.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. um, but it helped me slow my mind down, and it helped me see like, oh, I do this thing where like I'm experiencing attraction to women. And then there's this voice. Oh, but do you? Do you really? Isn't this about what you're supposed to feel? Do you really? And so weed helped me see that that pattern was still there, right? Um, but I think it's also important to be careful with how we question and how we introspect, and sometimes it can be antagonistic.
Yeah, right. It's like kind of if I mean introspection is good, but like constant doubting of yourself is
Doubting.
the further, that's then it goes too far if you do the introspection but then can't trust it because you're overthinking it, which I do all the time. So let me ask
Same.
you this, like how do you or how can anyone disentangle your own feelings or your attractions from patriarchy or other hierarchies? Like they get so tangled up. How do you disentangle it?
This is an enormous question.
We could do a whole. We could do the rest of the episode on this. I'm like always trying to do this, and it's. I don't know. It's hard.
It is very, 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 very hard. Okay. Um, so let's start there. Let's start there. Like, we're talking about foundations of the world that we live in. That's what that's what we're talking about. And so, how do you? It's enormous. It's an enormous question. And I think one of the ways certainly is to learn about people who have already been doing this work, to learn about movements like healing justice. That really helped me with all of this like healing stuff and therapy and neuroscience. It's like the why. It's the why. Like we heal to liberate. We heal so we can get ourselves out of these systems. And so it marries these two sort of like worlds. And I think also like this idea of non-attachment, and I'm kind of going to do a really bad job sort of explaining this because this is really from like Buddhist teachings and like Indian and Eastern sort of ideas about spirituality and things. And I'm gonna try not to overstep too much, but essentially, a lot of us can over-identify with these labels or these concepts of ourselves, or over-identify with the story of who we are. So I'll share a personal example. For a long time, I thought of myself as like, oh, I'm a really nice guy. I'm really sweet. And I mean, yeah, perhaps, like, right? Like, perhaps that's kind of where I live and that's where I want to live and like that's my neighborhood, right? But there are going to be these moments throughout my life that will never stop coming where the moment is calling for me to be assertive, to stand up for people, to stand up for myself, to not take shit. There are going to be these moments, really important moments. And if I'm so identified with, oh no, but like I'm nice and I'm gentle, I don't want to be a patriarch, I don't want to be evil, I don't want to be bad. There are these moments that require me to say, this is where I stop. Don't come over here. Don't come over here. And you have to go somewhere else. There are going to be moments that require that from me. And so if I'm so attached to this story of who JR is, oh no, I'm so nice. I'm teaching people about introspection. I'm so peaceful. I'm healed. I'm healed, right? Healed. That's not gonna that's not being in the present moment. That's being in the story. That's being in something else. That's being in, oh, like this version of me versus like, wait, what is required right now? What's happening right now? Like I gotta remind myself sometimes, like, I'm from New York. Like 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 you got to chill out with all of that. Like, sit down. Like, something, you know what I mean? So, I think that has been helpful. Like, not being so tied to identities, um, and having a clear compass, like the healing justice compass. Those two things have really, really helped me a lot.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. It's very helpful for me too, because I often feel that same way where it's like, yeah, I want to be the nice guy or, the smart guy or whatever. And like sometimes the situation calls for something else. Yeah, that is really interesting. That makes a lot of sense. So, and I want to get to this power and consent stuff again, even though we touched on it. But first, there's a lot about biphobia in the book, and it's a very important topic to understand for all of us. And I feel like you go even deeper than what I've thought about before about biphobia. I mean, you lay it out, but you go even deeper and you write something that resonated with me, which was that sometimes bi people seem to be the quickest to downplay biphobia or not consider it that big of a deal, and I do that too. I'm like, oh, there is that biphobia, but like I can deal with it and it's not as bad as homophobia and stuff like that. Why do you think we do that? And how might we, like, why is this uniquely difficult for bi people and how might we approach that differently?
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you so much for this question and like catching that. Yeah, yeah, thank you. um okay. So, this for me really came from internalized anti-blackness. And so much of the book is about unlearning internalized anti-blackness and unlearning internalized biphobia. And so, being of an oppressed group, of an oppressed identity, it can condition you to normalize um, your oppression. And so you might not see certain things as, oh, so bad, right? Like, oh, I've dealt with worse, right?
Right. Yeah.
This is not a 10 out of the 0 to 10 scale, right? So, it's not that serious. And so that is insidious because that allows you to normalize it. I think that this book could not be written without me having seen these pyramids, of like structures of like how like um, things like rape culture work, or how things like purity culture work. At the tops of these pyramids are like sexual violence against women, sexual violence in general. But at the bottom of the pyramid, the thing that holds the whole pyramid up is like, oh, just little jokes. Like, oh, yeah, yeah, shouldn't wear that. Or just little. right?
The
Little comments,
attitudes, the
the
micro things. Yeah.
attitudes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That would not exist if we didn't live in this whole thing, and the whole thing can't stand if that doesn't exist. And so, like, talking about biphobia in particular, I mentioned the show Love Victor, and how like I talked about it online and I read comments, not just from posts that I've done, but also comments on about the show from bi or pan people, and a lot of them kind of seem to have compassion, right? They had compassion for all the gay men out there who didn't realize they were gay until they tried to like date a girl and then eventually realized. And I love that compassion. Compassion is important. And also, you can use compassion against yourself, right? And against people of your marginalized background. Look, oh, gay people have it really bad and they should have their stories told. Yeah, duh. Also, what's also true is, under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, in terms of representation, gay white men have had, like, they have the monopoly on that. You know what I'm saying? Their stories are the stories. And so, what you have with a show like Love Victor is you have a show that in the trailer and in the first, I believe I wrote 8 episodes, they are showing us a young bisexual boy. Period.
Hmm.
That's what they're showing us. Go back to the trailer. Go back to the first
Hmm.
8 episodes. They're showing us desire that this boy has for a girl and desire that this boy has for a boy. That's what they're showing us.
Hmm.
And then in episode 8, I believe it is, things start to get weird. And so I talked about that show in particular because, it was such a big show. I really liked it a lot. It was recommended to me. And I think that was one of the first moments where, like, I felt like offended by like media in like a very long time. And offended is not really a feeling that I am like very in touch with. Like, I'm not very in touch with like feeling offended. But I was offended with that show, and like I was like, oh my gosh. Because of how they did it. They showed us a bisexual boy the whole time. And then it's very clear in the writing, you're a writer, I'm a writer, that something changes around episode 8. Something changes. It doesn't, it's no longer a bisexual boy who is like having all of these anxieties of being a teenager and also maybe also some internalized biphobia. It's not just that. Something changes in the writing, and they're talking about a gay boy now who's like
Hmm.
trying to force himself to like her. But that's not what was happening in the early episodes. He wanted to kiss her. He saw her, and sometimes his heart was racing. He had imaginations. That's not the same thing as what happens for the rest of the season. And I haven't seen season 2 yet. I stopped watching, but yeah,
Huh. It's
yeah.
That's interesting. I haven't seen that either. I saw Love Simon, but not Love Victor,
Hmm.
partially because I heard some of this stuff and I was like, you know what, I'm just
Uh,
not going to get into it.
yeah.
But that makes so much sense. I'm not surprised that that happened, and it's like the same goes back to how can we recognize ourselves and be in touch with how we really are when we see stuff like that. And it's like, oh, here's someone maybe who has a similar experience to me as a bisexual person. And then the whole world shifts and says, oh, this person's gay. Like the whole conversation shifts, it sounds like. And so no wonder we doubt ourselves and we constantly check in and think, wait, am I just gay? And I was trying to force that attraction. And like that's the media representation. Let's talk about that for a minute. Like in general, the landscape of media representation of these identities. Like, what do you think is still missing? And what's the effect of this kind of either in by invisibility or negative by representation? How does that affect this community?
Once again, an
I
enormous
know you could
question,
do
but thank you.
you could do a whole episode on every question and every chapter of your book, probably.
Thank you. Um, I I kind in the book I talk about noticing a trend, certainly from when I was younger till now, and how that has changed, even if that has only been very small. But certainly when I was younger, it was unthinkable that like, oh, in 15 years or 20 years, there's going to be some positive representations of bisexual men, bisexual black men. That was completely unthinkable for me as a child, as a young adult. And I would say that when I was younger, it was exclusively negative, exclusively a joke, exclusively horrific at times. Whereas now, it's hit or miss a lot of times. And there is certainly a lot of, biphobia, by erasure, especially. But there's also some shows, some films that get it really right. And it's almost like, whoa, that was incredible. And one that comes to mind is a show called Grownish. And yeah, and so there was a relationship between a gentleman named Des and Jazz. And what I loved personally about that sort of representation was that, well, first of all, as a black bi man, or actually, he uses queer more specifically to him. He uses queer, and yeah, this is like somebody who is on the track team, who is out and proud, and definitely is attracted to men and very happy to, you know, yes, love men, and also is like very into women, and it just depends on the person. And he also has some fluidity going on in terms of like his appearance, in terms of like what he wears, what he puts on. And so what I love about the show is that there were definitely women who were interested in him, and the relationship that he has with Jazz, she's interested in him, and his bisexuality is not a deterrent. But what is a deterrent is his gender presentation. So he's a person who wears dresses, skirts, things like that. And so that kind of becomes something that is like not something that she's attracted to or is able to, I don't know, like she's not really interested in that. So what I like about that is because that's like very nuanced. That is like extremely nuanced to me. Like, oh, like yeah, like first of all, she thought you were gay at first, and it was like, oh no, like I'm not gay. I also like women. And it was like, oh, cool. I didn't know that. Cool. And then it's like, oh, let's date. Yes, let's date. That's dope. And they have a lot going in common. They're both on the track team. And but the more he sort of expresses himself when it comes to gender presentation or just like what he wears, that is kind of the thing. It's not about his sexuality exactly. It's more so about gender and gender presentation, and breaking certain rules about gender, not just in the sexuality way, but in the presentation way. And so, like, even though like their sort of story ends in like like heartbreak or like rejection of the bi black male character, which I definitely can see how that can be painful to like a viewer who is also bi and black and maybe also is gender, I don't know, fluid or something, or just presents androgynously. I liked it because it presented that. And I liked it because it highlighted that. And also in that same show, um, they also had a bi character, a bi male character earlier on in previous seasons who was rejected by a bi woman character. And so they were highlighting like, oh, it's different for guys. Like male bisexuality is reacted in a completely different way than female bisexuality. And so the reason why I liked the representation was because they were highlighting that. It wasn't just like to dunk on bi black men. It wasn't just like, yeah, you guys are terrible. Right? It was to show some experiences. So that was so cool to me.
Yeah. That makes so much sense. I mean, I haven't seen Grownish. Now I want to watch it. But it reminds me of like some good bi representation that I've connected to and thought sort of, oh, is actually really diving into this in a good way. It was like the show I May Destroy You a few years ago. Did you see that show?
Yes, I did.
I love that show. I mean, it's good representation of multiple things, not just bisexuality. But what I liked about the bi male character there was that the conflict wasn't dealing with his own bisexuality; it was dealing with biphobia from other people. So, which is like so much more. I mean, yes, can be a struggle to accept our fluidity, but like once you get past that, then it's like a lifelong struggle against biphobia. And so that was really the focus of his storyline was dealing with this biphobia, especially as like a previously gay identified black bi man. And so that was, I thought, great representation, even though it was hard to watch. And also, it makes me think of this show, Sort of, which is about the gender fluidity that you're talking about and how that's relate, can be how it intersects with bisexuality. So it's just like sort of the next level. We're so used to seeing these network shows that are like, oh, the bi guy, who's he gonna choose, a man or a woman? And it's like that's not really what most of us are worried about. What do you want to see more of in terms of media representation?
Um, I guess variety. Variety is always what a bisexual answer, right? But but yeah, variety. A
Yeah,
wide variety of things. I think that's really what a lot of principled bisexual people, pansexual people are asking for is variety. That's really
yeah.
that's really what a lot of us are asking for. So yeah.
Cool. I love it. Okay, let's move on to this power and consent before we have the get to bonus stuff on Patreon. So, let me ask you the broad question. Like the title, you mentioned it. It's in the title, power and consent. Why are these important concepts for bi people, especially to understand and be aware of? Like, what do you want people to take away on this topic? That's a big question. Again, but people have to read the book for all the details.
Exactly. um, I think that, like I mentioned before, because of who my target audience is, I think I am imagining, even if it's not college aged people, even if you are in your 60s reading this, even if you are in your 40s reading this, 30s, what have you, but this is one of your first times, I guess, realizing that you are bi, pan fluid, the power and consent is like really one of the most foundational things. And these things, consent in particular, create safety. And that's something that's so missing in our world. Safety for marginalized people, really. And so, I wanted people to really focus on power structures because when you talk to principled gay and lesbian people, that's what they're talking about. If they have gripes with bisexual people. Okay, you're bi and you're dating a cisgender woman. Okay, great. Power though, politics. If you're talking to a principled gay or lesbian person, that's really what they're getting at. Okay, what are your politics? What are the politics? Are you against this power structure that exists to harm us? Great, you might have some like societal, like society sees you as like a heterosexual cisgender couple, both of you are cisgender, both of you are heterosexual, um and so there's some protection to that, right? And also some pain and erasure to that, as I talk about in the book. It's not all just all good, right? But connecting your queerness or politicizing your bisexuality, it's already politicized. As much as I don't want it to be, as much as I don't want to be seen as radical just because I'm black, disruptive to the system just because I'm bi. That's just what, because the power structure is so racist, anti-black racism, because the power is so cisgender heterosexist, it politicizes me. And so are you going to politicize your desire? Are you going to politicize your identities? Are you going to read? Are you going to do critical theory? Are you going to engage? Are you going to um, do something about this?
Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense to me because it's like, and especially being in sort of a default hierarchy and being in the top of the hierarchy for much of my life, like it's invisible. And then bisexuality sort of gave me like a window into what it's like to not have all the power and to have to actually like relate to people differently. And I think that politicize, like, then I realized, oh, this is a political identity too, because it's connecting me to other things. When I hear people say, oh, I'm not very political, like I you know, to me that's just such a luxury to be able to not be political, because your identity is not being politicized. So okay, you have the luxury to not care. But the more, I've examined myself, then it's like, oh, advocating for this stuff is personal and political, and it's the same thing. So that chapter about, you write about Sherry Eisner, who's been on the podcast. I think we might have quoted some of the same stuff that they wrote in our
Yeah.
respective books. We have a few. You also quoted Jane Ward on some of this stuff, I think, from Two
Oh,
Bi Guys. You
yeah,
actually,
yeah, on the
you actually,
podcast. Yeah.
yeah, I think I used part of that quote in my book too. You mentioned Two Bi Guys a lot in your book. I appreciate the shout outs. That was very nice to see. But yeah, it really does end up being political, like, just because of the way the world is. Like, it shouldn't necessarily be like, if the world just what was more fair, and we cared about every individual and everything people are going through, then maybe we wouldn't have to make this a political identity. But the world is so hierarchical and structured and unfair that once you feel this stuff and understand it, it sort of becomes a political identity naturally, if you're really thinking about it. Thanks for listening to this episode with J.R. Yussuf. Hope you have enjoyed it so far. If you want even more, you're in luck. There's more. It's not here, but it's on Patreon. There's over 25 minutes of extra bonus content with JR, plus full video of the entire interview, as well as full videos of every interview from last season and moving forward. In the 25 minutes of bonus content, JR and I talked about consent and power dynamics. We really finally dove into that. We talked about how consent and power dynamics work with men and women and other genders, and like what can happen in there for bi people as they're navigating that. We talked about the pressure on bi people to, quote, pick a side, and also the pressure to pick women and to pick having biological kids. It's often not like pick a side, it's often like pick that side. We talked about that. We also talked about like the line between bi sex positivity versus fetishization of bi people. And we also talked about what JR calls and what Robin Oakes calls a biphobia shield, how to shield yourself from biphobia and bi negativity, and even internalized biphobia and homophobia. Check it out at patreon.com/Robert Brooks Cohen. For more information about everything I do, my book, my writing, my coaching practice, visit robertbrookscohen.com. And now here is the very tail end of my interview with JR. Thanks for listening. Well, thank you so much for being here, JR. This has been a lovely conversation and great to see you again after so many years. Hopefully we can catch up in New York someday when I'm there. Tell everyone, okay, when does the book exactly come out, and how can people find it and find your other work? Where can they find stuff?
Thank you so much, Rob. Okay, the book comes out April 16th, 2024. I'm very excited. because it is published by North Atlantic Books, but it's also distributed by Penguin Random House, which means that you will be able to find it anywhere. So
Awesome.
also on my website, jrussuf.com slash additionals, there's also like an online sort of complementary resource to the book. It's meant to be in combination with the book. So that's where you can find
Cool.
the stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. I encourage you to check out the website and the additionals because there's a lot of stuff in here. Like it's a little bit of like a workbook in a way. There's like sort of exercises and things to think through, and I'm assuming some of that kind of stuff is in the additionals too, of like what can you think about in your own life or check in with. So yeah, check that out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and it's a lot of support. So, in the book
Mm,
there is like this unearthing of a lot of like things maybe within some of the readers, and the online resource is tons and tons of support. So if
cool.
the read is a little intense for you, if you're feeling like a little like whoa, this is a lot, there's a
Uh,
lot of support online.
Good. Awesome. Wonderful. And we'll put links to all of that stuff in the show notes. The book is Dear by Men, A Black Man's Perspective on Power, Consent, Breaking Down Binaries, and Combating Erasure. Thanks again for being here, J.R. Yusuf.
Thank you, thanks for having me, I appreciate it.
Two By Guys is produced and edited by me, Robert Brooks Cohen, and it was created by me and Alex Boyd. Our logo art is by Caitlin Weinman. Our music is by Ross Mincer. We are supported by the Gotham, and we are part of the Zencaster Creator Network. Visit patreon.com/Robert Brooks Cohen for bonus content, early access, and exclusive video episodes. Thanks for listening to Two By Guys.